and thank you all for joining me. I'm your host Sam, and today we're going to be talking about the case of Albert DESALVO, also known as the Boston Strangler. Today's video deals with topics like domestic violence, sexual assault, and murder. If you feel that you are unable to handle these topics, please turn back now. Albert DESALVO was born on September 3rd, 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, to parents Frank and Charlotte DESALVO. Being born in the midst of the Great Depression was not exactly a great start, but even after Albert was born, he never really had a great role model. His father Frank was an alcoholic with more than a temper. He would regularly beat his wife Charlotte in front of their children. One time, he knocked all of Charlotte's teeth out and bent her fingers backwards until they broke, in front of their kids. He also would bring back sex workers and engage in sexual acts with them in front of Charlotte and their children. This led to young Albert developing his own cruel hobbies, including torturing animals. This is actually one of the early signs of becoming a potential serial killer, along with setting fires and wetting the bed past the average age. Killers like to have control of the situation, and since little Albert could not control his home environment, he took control in the form of harming innocent creatures. He also became a frequent shoplifter and started to be known by the local police. When he was 12 years old, he was arrested for the first time for battery and robbery and was sent to the local reform school called the Lyman School for Boys. This school was strict with their days starting at 5 a.m. and lights out at 8 p.m. Corporal punishment was allowed at the time, so students were sometimes hit with rulers or flogged with a bicycle tube tied to a wooden handle. Each boy received a daily ration of cigarettes distributed to the group one at a time. They also earned credits for good behavior, and eventually with enough credits, they could be paroled. In November of 1944, Albert was paroled and started to work as a delivery boy, but he was sent back to the same school 3 years later for stealing a car. After he finished his second sentence at the reform school, he decided to join the army in 1948. He was used to the strict regimen of the school and figured it would be a perfect fit for service. He was described by those who remember him as quite the ladies' man when they were out in Germany. He wouldn't last long, however, as he was discharged after his first tour of duty. Albert decided to re-enlist, and in spite of being tried in a court-martial for disobeying orders, he was somehow honorably discharged once more. Following this, Albert served as a military police sergeant with the 2nd Squadron, 14th Armored Cavalry Regiment. He also settled down and got married to a woman that he met during his time in Germany, named Irmgard Beck. She and Albert got married, and she soon gave birth to a handicapped child. Because of this, Irmgard tried to avoid being intimate with her husband, as she was afraid they would not be able to afford another handicapped child. Regardless, she eventually gave birth to a healthy baby boy. To all outsiders, Albert seemed like the ideal family man. He was well liked by his colleagues and his boss, and had a loving family, but not all was as it seemed. In the early 1960s, a series of crimes began to occur around the area of Cambridge. A man in his late 20s went door to door looking for young women. He was suave, smooth-talking, and introduced himself as a talent scout for a modeling agency. If a woman was interested in becoming a model, the man would enter their home and ask to measure them with measuring tape. In the process, he would inappropriately fondle the women as he took their measurements, sometimes sexually assaulting them. Several similar incidents were reported to police, and this man was given the nickname of the Measuring Man, or the Green Man, because he was seen wearing green clothing sometimes. As you can probably tell, the Green Man was Albert. He broke into over 400 homes across Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and sexually assaulted over 300 women. At the same time that police were looking for the Green Man, a series of murders began to appear in the Boston area. The first of these murders took place on June 14, 1962, on Gainsborough Street in Boston. 55-year-old Anna Sleesers was a Latvian-born seamstress and devoted churchgoer who lived by herself in a brick house apartment. She had just finished dinner and was settling into a bath when there was a knock at the door. That evening, her son was supposed to pick her up to attend a memorial service. However, when he called her name, she didn't answer. He eventually found her body on the bathroom floor, a cord wrapped around her neck and tied in a bow. Her son's first reaction wasn't that she was murdered, however. He thought that she had taken her own life. But that's not what police thought. The apartment was a mess, as if it had been ransacked, but a gold watch and some other expensive items were still behind, making robbery an unlikely motive. And worse, Anna's body was found nude, and there were signs she was sexually assaulted. but police weren't sure what to make of it and decided to rule the case a botched robbery. Perhaps Anna had gotten in the way of a robbery, or the perpetrator had just fled before stealing anything because they were afraid of being caught. But just 2 weeks later, on the 28th of June, an 85-year-old woman named Mary Mullins was found dead in her home from a similar style attack. Another botched robbery with a sexual motive. The ransacking of homes didn't make sense to police considering there wasn't anything of value actually taken. And then, just 2 days later, police found 2 more victims in 2 different homes. First, they found 68-year-old Nina Nichols in her home in Brighton. She was undressed with her legs spread wide open, as if the killer wanted to degrade her. The tops of her stockings were tied in a bow. 65-year-old Helen Blake, who was found on the same day, suffered a more gruesome murder. There were lacerations around her genitals and behind. Her bra was tied into a bow around her neck, similar to how Nina's stockings were tied to a bow. Both of their homes were also ransacked, just like the previous 2 murders, but nothing really was taken. Police were starting to connect the dots. After the 4th murderer, Boston's police commissioner, a man named Edmund McNamara, sent out warnings to all of Boston's women, advising them to lock their doors and not open them for strangers. He also canceled all police leave at the time so that officers could be out patrolling and working as much as possible on the case. Many universities in the area had curfews for women, and some people even moved out of the area entirely. So many people went to the Animal Rescue League to buy dogs that they actually sold all of their dogs. By now, police had begun profiling the suspected killer. They knew the killer had a hatred of women based on the degrading positions he placed their bodies in. They figured it could stem back to a relationship with his own mother and that he expressed psychopathic traits. In the meantime, police worked overtime on the case. They were hoping those in Boston would get the message, but unfortunately the killer would attack a little over 3 weeks later on August 19th. 75-year-old Ida Urga lived in an apartment on Grove Street in Boston and was found strangled to death. Her nightdress had been ripped and her body was placed in a provocative manner so that it was the first thing someone would see when they entered her apartment. Despite this, there was no sign of forced entry. While police were working on the details surrounding the latest victim, a 6th murder was committed the following day. 67-year-old Jane Sullivan was found dead in her home in Dorchester, strangled by her own stockings. She was found face down in a bathtub of shallow water and was in a kneeling position. She had actually been killed about a week prior, but her body had gone the entire week without being discovered. By this point, terror was sweeping throughout the Boston area. Older women feared being targeted and killed by the mysterious killer. But it would be another 3 months before the killer would strike again, and this time, the victim wouldn't fit the profile. 20-year-old Sophie Clark was considered a cautious and safe person, and she rarely dated. She was a student in the area and actually lived only a few blocks away from the killer's first victim, Anna Sleeser. Somehow, despite her knack towards safety, Sophie had still let the victim into her home and was found lying on her living room floor on December 5th. Her stockings were tied around her neck, and her legs were found spread apart, just like the previous victims. Police actually got a lead in this case, as one of Sophie's neighbors told police that a man had knocked on her door saying that he was sent to paint her apartment. This woman, named Marcella Luca, lived in the same building and mentioned that around 2:20 a man had knocked on her door and said that the supervisors had sent him to see about painting in the apartment. He then told her that she'd need to have her bathroom ceiling fixed and complimented her on her figure, asking her if she ever thought of modeling. She placed her fingers to her lips, and this man became angry. She said that his character seemed to change almost completely. She told the man that her husband was sleeping in the next room, and he quickly said he had the wrong apartment and left. She described the man as being around 25 to 30 years old, of average height with honey-colored hair. He was wearing a dark jacket and dark green trousers. But a few weeks later, on New Year's Eve, the killer would strike again, in the Back Bay area near where the killer's first and most recent victims were killed. The body of pregnant 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was found murdered in her own apartment. Her body was discovered by her boss when she didn't show up for work. She was found underneath bloody sheets in her bed, stockings tied around her neck. Police tried to find possible connections between the victims and anyone they knew, but nothing came up other than that they all lived within the Boston area. They began to interview every known sex offender in the city's files, but they couldn't find any evidence of them committing the crimes. And the killing had seemingly stopped, too. For all of January and February, he was silent. But on the 9th of March, he would unfortunately strike again. 25 miles north of Boston, in the city of Lawrence, 68-year-old Mary Brown was found strangled and sexually assaulted in her own apartment. She was found to be stabbed in the chest with a fork. On the 6th of May, 23-year-old Beverly Sammons was found in her Cambridge home, stabbed a total of 26 times in the neck and torso. She had missed choir practice on the day of her murder and was found as a result. 2 scarves and stockings were tied around her neck after her death, the signature killing card of the Boston Strangler. By now there had been 10 victims, and the killer likely wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Police were desperate at this point. They even asked for the help of a psychic, but that didn't provide any answers. The psychic claimed the killer was an escaped psychiatric patient, which, as you likely know, isn't true. The Boston area was absolutely terrified of this killer as a result. As a local reporter named Eddie Corsetti put it, every time you picked up the newspaper, there was a strangling story. We just kept it up, and there were hawkers on street corners yelling, "Extra, extra, Strangler strikes again." A $10,000 reward was offered for information leading to the murderer's arrest, but no one came forward. That September, about 25 miles from Boston in the city of Salem, Massachusetts, the 11th victim of the Boston Strangler would be found. Her name was Evelyn Corbin, and she was 58 years old. DNA was able to be recovered from her body, as was the case in some of the previous victims, but this was the early 1960s, and DNA technology was rather primitive. 2 months later, on the 23rd of November, 23-year-old Joanne Graff was found in her Lawrence apartment, sexually assaulted and killed like the other victims. She had stockings tied around her neck as well. But witnesses described a man who looked similar to the one who had asked to paint the other woman's apartment the previous December. The description was of a man wearing dark green slacks, a dark shirt, and jacket. Police were on the lookout once more, but unfortunately not in time to catch the killer's 13th and final victim. Just a few days past the new year of 1964, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan's roommate came home to find Mary in bed, surrounded by blood. She had been strangled with a stocking and sexually assaulted with a broom handle. Wedged between her feet was a card with Happy New Year written on it. The apartment was also ransacked, though nothing of high value was taken. Police were easily able to connect this victim to the previous 12. As you are likely aware, the Green Man and the Boston Strangler are all one and the same. However, police at the time thought that these perpetrators were different men, and they didn't connect the crimes. Looking back now, it seems pretty obvious, but there were differences in the calling cards of these perpetrators, and so Albert was able to get away with his crimes for much longer than he should have been. As the city of Boston panicked, a task force set up by Attorney General Edward Brooke was set to solve the case of the Boston Strangler. He assigned permanent staff just to the case of the Strangler and even brought on Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley, who was known for being a bit unconventional with his methods. These included making the entire force read through thousands of pages of material that stretched across multiple police forces. As it was the 60s, departments in different cities were not as able to easily connect to each other about crimes like they are today. They also started profiling the killer further. Criminal profiling was in its infancy stages at this point, so their science wasn't quite accurate, but they believed the killer was in his 30s, worked with his hands, and was most likely a loner. Meanwhile, Albert was committing break-ins left and right. On one occasion, he broke into a woman's apartment and tied her up. He held a knife to her throat before sexually assaulting her and leaving. He didn't kill her, though, and she was able to give police a good description of him. This description matched a sketch used previously of Albert when he was convicted on another breaking and entering charge years prior. Soon, police were able to arrest him. But you see, Albert loved to brag. He was known for it, actually. So, once he was questioned, Albert admitted to being the Green Man, and eventually being the Boston Strangler. Because of his history with embellishing the truth, police didn't necessarily believe his confession, but they sent him to a local psychiatric hospital to be assessed anyway. He was also assigned an attorney named F. Lee Bailey. When Bailey told Albert's wife that he had actually confessed, she said she didn't believe him and that he was likely only doing it for the financial benefits from local newspapers. His friends and family didn't believe he was guilty either. Bailey also recorded 50 hours of interviews with Albert, which was about 20,000 pages of transcript. In these interviews, Albert described the crimes in details only the killer would know, even describing what the victims were wearing. But just as quickly as he had confessed, Albert retracted his confessions. He had become friends with a fellow killer named George Nassar while in prison, and some believe George had convinced Albert to fight his charges. As there was no actual physical evidence to tie Albert to the cases of the Boston Strangler, he was only being charged with the Green Man assaults. He was sentenced to prison for life in his role as the Green Man, and was sent to the Walpole Maximum Security Prison in 1967. He wouldn't spend long there, however, as 6 years later he was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate. With his death went the true identity of the Boston Strangler. Or did it? As DNA technology advanced, so did the chances of finding the Boston Strangler's true identity. Just as recently as 2013, the Boston Police Department used DNA from Albert's still alive nephew and compared it to DNA found at the scene of the final victim, Mary Sullivan. Albert's nephew was not very cooperative, so police did a sting operation where they surveilled the nephew until he discarded a water bottle, and they used his DNA from his discarded water bottle, as once you throw something out, police are able to totally obtain that, and that could be evidence. The DNA was a near certain match of 99.9%. Albert's body was also exhumed, and the DNA from his femur and teeth came back with the same results. Albert had definitely killed the last victim in the Boston Strangler case. Despite this being proved, none of the other cases in the Boston Strangler case have been definitively proven to be Albert. There was no DNA evidence, so we only know that he actually did the last crime, but what are the chances that he didn't commit any of the other ones and just committed the last one in a similar fashion to the other previous crimes? I'd like to hear your theories on this case. I'm personally very convinced that Albert DeSalvo committed all of the Boston strangling crimes. All of the crimes had very similar crime scenes, and he described details of the cases that no one else would know. It just seems that things were very primitive in the 60s, so they couldn't definitively say it's him, and unfortunately we just don't have the DNA to back it up now. But I do think it was him. Regardless, I'd be interested to see some of your other theories. Maybe you can convince me of something otherwise. Thank you again for watching. I really do appreciate it. I know that it is a bit difficult to switch, if you're used to my TikToks, to switch to my YouTube channel, my longer content. But thank you all for watching. I really do appreciate all of you who have helped make this possible. If you're interested in watching some shorter, more frequent posts, I'm pretty active on TikTok every day, and my username will be linked in the description, and it should be on the screen now. I have a couple other podcast episodes out, so feel free to check them out. But in the meantime, thank you again for watching, and I will see you soon.